This is Democracy Watch. Mark, we've spent the last couple of days talking about Donald Trump's open defiance of a Supreme Court ruling. This isn't just any court ruling. This is the Supreme Court ruling unanimously 9-0 to return Kilmar Abrego Garcia to the United States. Trump had a press conference in the Oval Office where he basically mocked the federal judiciary in this country, saying that there's nothing he could do, and Bukele saying that there's nothing he could do. And so we've spoken at length about how clearly we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis in this country, but legally speaking, it would occur when the Supreme Court issues a ruling that the Trump administration and the executive branch then opt to defy. So what is your read of the moment that we're in right now?
So look, in this case, you got it exactly right. You have, this spectacle, and really it was a disgraceful spectacle of the President of the United States, a foreign head of state, the president of El Salvador, the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, and oddly Stephen Miller. Like, I don't understand what he was doing there, Brian.
Yeah.
But because I don't even think he's a lawyer. But anyway, you've got them there, and they're sort of both sort of mocking the idea that this individual who has been wrongfully sent to a hellhole, to essentially a El Salvadorian equivalent of the Gulag, through an administrative error that the Department of Justice admitted. And they are sort of making light of the situation and also badly mischaracterizing what the Supreme Court said, right? The Supreme Court, as you say, upheld the lower court decision that said that the United States needs to facilitate to get this guy back. And instead, you have Stephen Miller opining that actually the Supreme Court ruled the other way. You have Pam Bondi, a total disgrace, spouting nonsense. And so what it means is that the federal district court judge who now has this case, right, because the Supreme Court ruled and sent it back to the federal district court, that district court judge is quite angry because the federal district court judge has asked for some simple things for the Department of Justice, for example, to provide daily updates on what their efforts are to get this person back. And the Department of Justice is not complying. They're filing them late. They don't include all the information. And finally, you had this federal district court judge sort of at the end of her fuse and just say, look, I'm going to let there be discovery in this case so that we can get to the bottom of what's going on here. And I suspect, Brian, what we're going to find at the bottom of what's going on here is a lot of willful disobedience with a court order, which then leads to contempt. And it is at that point that I think this case will join now another case that we have an update on also, in where federal judges have just said enough is enough.
The concern that I have is when you're looking at a situation where contempt charges are being considered, it feels so inadequate for the moment that we're in. This is basically the Trump administration planting their flag and saying, we don't care what the other branches of government say. We are all powerful. And so in a scenario where you have basically a budding dictator, a budding autocrat who's discarding the legal edicts of the judicial branch and the legislative branch, if the legislative branch didn't contract all its power to Trump anyway, but basically discarding their prerogatives, their legal prerogatives, then doesn't engaging in these contempt charges feel wholly inadequate for the moment that we're in right now? Trump knows. He's already written that off.
Yeah, look, I think I understand your frustration. And in fact, just before we recorded, I had someone call me and express basically the same sentiment, which is like, okay, so Mark, I read what you write on Democracy Docket. I hear you on Brian when you talk to him. But bottom line are, with all of these machinations, are these individuals going to come back, whether it's the Venezuelans who were wrongfully sent in violation of one court order, or in this case, the El Salvadoran from Maryland who was sent in violation of an existing order? And the short answer is it doesn't seem so. And I understand why people are completely flabbergasted by that, because this guy who was sent in violation of an order, in error, at best in error, what's the point of all these court proceedings if those people are, if this isn't going to remedy it? And so the courts don't have the ability to make the government of El Salvador or even the president of the United States to do something here.
Right.
All it can do is exercise the muscle that it has by making there be consequences for the people who have been involved. And that would include potentially the Department of Justice lawyers. It would include people at the Immigration Service, perhaps at DHS more broadly. But I understand why that leaves people cold. But that's why we need Congress to be more involved, because the fact is, you say that what could even Congress do? There are things Congress could do if Congress were willing to act. But of course, the Republicans in Congress are not going to act. And so we are left with feeling like, well, all there are the courts. And in a situation like this, it isn't necessarily enough.
And so there are two issues here. One is the remedy, the immediate remedy in terms of the folks who these cases actually concern, and that's Abrego Garcia, for example, and these other wrongly deported migrants. But the broader issue is the prospect of a full-blown constitutional crisis where the Trump administration no longer sees itself as being bound by the system of checks and balances from the other branches of government. And so in that scenario, do you think that this is the moment where the Trump administration is basically breaking free of the constraints that have bound this government for over 200 years and saying, look, this is us planting our flag. We no longer give a shit what the other branches of government have to say. We no longer feel like we have to be bound by any court rulings, even if it's a court ruling handed down by a unanimous decision in the U.S. Supreme Court. We're just going to do our own thing. And this is us basically saying, things are different now.
Yeah. So I think that we are certainly on the cusp of that. I mean, the question, Brian, is whether or not Donald Trump is going to be able to find enough fools and cowards to continue to advance these propositions. I use that phrase on purpose because that's the phrase that Hagan Scott, and you may remember, he was a line prosecutor in the Southern District of New York who was asked who was fired for not dismissing the case against Eric Adams. And he wrote this very important letter, in my view, that said, you were always going to find some fool or coward to file your motion, but it was never going to be me. And the question is whether or not Donald Trump has an endless supply of fools and cowards who are willing to continue to follow this path and to file these pleadings and sworn declarations in federal courts, because they are subject to discipline. I mean, they are subject. The lawyers can be disbarred. The non-lawyers and the lawyers could be held in contempt. They could be fined. They could be jailed. Is there going to be an endless supply of people who are willing to do that for Donald Trump? Now, so far, the answer is there is a supply, and certainly there's $1 billion of free legal services. I guess he owes from is owed to him from some of the big law firms. So who knows? Maybe he'll start using them for cannon fodder. But the system, Brian, assumes that these collateral consequences, being held in contempt, would be a sufficient threat that it would cause people to recoil from doing things that Donald Trump wants them to do.
And just to push back a little bit on that, is there a scenario, though, where somebody could be held in contempt, and we know because of the Supreme Court that Donald Trump has full pardon power, and then that pardon power is plenary, and so if somebody is held in contempt by the judicial branch, that they could just be absolved of any culpability, of any responsibility for their actions by Trump himself?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we could potentially wind up exactly there, where you have this cycle of people held in contempt, and he pardons them, and then we go round and round. But again, I don't want to be an apologist for a system that is not meeting the moment. And in many respects, the judicial system is not meeting the moment. But it is the only system right now that is holding Donald Trump accountable at all across any vectors. And so it is not going to be perfect, and it is going to lead to some really terrible outcomes, including likely in this case for these individuals in El Salvador. But compared to what Congress is doing, compared to what the other alternatives are, it is still the best we have. And you would hope that the stigma of being found in contempt might be something, although I know what you're going to say, which is that in the Trump world, it's a badge of honor. So what stigma is there?
Yeah. Well, look, I want to finish off with this, and I do want to try and I want to give you the opportunity to offer up some words of hope here, because I even I, and I'm sure you can feel this, came to you with a pretty grim outlook on the state of things today as the result of what we're seeing right now from the Trump administration. And so, what do you say to folks out there who see this and feel like any effort to hold these folks doing something illegal is doomed, is a futile effort. And so what's the point of continuing to engage?
Yeah. So look, we can't, Donald Trump wants us to stop engaging, right? He wants us to think that he is all powerful and he will win everything and that there is no point in fighting back. And that just isn't true. We see instances in which he is losing. He loses in court and it has real consequences. These cases are the hardest of the hard because they involve his power to negotiate with foreign governments. They are heartbreaking and they are terrible. And they, you can imagine just what a terrible tragedy this is. And how much worse it can be. We're only months into this administration, but you can't lose sight of the fact that, there are programs that Donald Trump and DOJ tried to shut down that have been restarted. There are people who were fired that were forced to be rehired. There are laws that he tried to suspend that have been put back in place. And so there are places where the courts are making a difference. They are not going to be the solution. The solution is going to be in 2026 to have midterm elections in which Democrats retake control of the House and Senate, and then a robust Congress will have the power of the purse to defund parts of the federal government that may not be following its law, to have its own subpoena power, its own contempt power, its own ability to bring certain kinds of litigation. And that is the great tragedy right now, is that our constitutional system was assumed that the tension would be between the congressional branch and the executive branch. And because Republicans control Congress right now, we are putting all of this on the courts, and the courts are not necessarily meeting the moment, but people can't give up hope.
Perfectly put. And look, I think your argument is the perfect one, and highly recommend for folks who are watching right now to support the work that you do, where you speak in greater detail about exactly what were you talking about there, to sign up for Democracy Docket. It's the news outlet Marc founded to focus on everything voting and elections. It is an incredible resource that I use on a daily basis. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.